Reviving a classic car. The trials and tribulations. The decision to rescue a classic car, whether it be a recommission or a full restoration, is rarely a straightforward process. The need to expect the unexpected is a given, and most seasoned car enthusiasts would agree that the idea of setting a budget is pretty futile. So despite this sounding like some thankless pastime, it is an endeavour many pursue passionately, finding that the rewards outweigh the painstaking time and effort initially invested. It is also worth noting that enjoying the process is a key element in rising to the challenges that will likely be faced along the way. The reasoning behind such projects can vary greatly, but nostalgia will typically be at the source. The approach can span from an originality stance, where the car must be as it left the factory, through a middle ground where it is generally accepted that a few modifications would serve the car well, and then all the way to the extremes of resto mods where, in some cases, little of the original car will remain. This latter approach will likely produce a more advanced car, and whilst there is a risk here of losing the character and charm of the original car, fortunately, there is room enough for all approaches to keep the classic car world interesting. Choosing the appropriate way forward for a car's future is perhaps best achieved by considering both its rarity and condition. A cherished survivor would surely be a piece of history to be preserved. A rare car potentially destined for the scrapyard may warrant a dedicated intervention, and the tired yet more common classic may offer the perfect blank canvas for a new vision. The car featured in this video serves to demonstrate the complexity and ever-shifting nature of nostalgia. Being a kit car from the very early 1980s, it would have challenged the purists of its day, but it is a mark and model in its own right, with its own history, and is now judged on the merits of the original design and its remarkable durability. Having been untouched for 9 years, it was decided to recommission this car, and despite being previously well maintained, the process took considerably longer than expected. There was a desire to retain the spirit of the original car, this being an affordable, easy-to-maintain sports car. And whilst this particular car is no track day racer, it provides all the driving entertainment that you would want on everyday roads. The following historical account serves to demonstrate why it was felt appropriate to respect and retain the originality of this car. First registered as a Marlin in 1983, the car has historic vehicle status, and it has not had any modifications to compromise this automotive landmark. The engine had a major rebuild 19,000 miles ago, including new pistons and rebore, crank grind and new bearings, a new oil pump, a head skim and new valve guides. The gearbox and overdrive unit had covered just 13,000 miles since they had both had a complete overhaul. 19 years previously, the bodywork had been given a full professional respray, and this appeared to have stood the test of time pretty well. Prior to being taken off the road, the front suspension and brakes had gone through an overhaul, including new suspension polybushes, braided flexible brake hoses, brake calipers, pads, rear wheel cylinders and brake shoes. And when factoring in this car's excellent service record, then surely this was going to be the easiest recommission ever. Naive optimism is a useful motivational tool in getting started on a car revival. However, there is no substitute for in-the-field knowledge to help avoid unnecessary pitfalls, hence this warts and all account. Most whom are familiar with automotive repairs will recognise the annoyance of a simple fix, escalating as other components that have worked perfectly for years strangely deciding to have issues. Although initially disheartening, it is best to see these scenarios as an improvement opportunity rather than a setback. Easily said after the event, but the car will be all the better for persevering. Due to unpredictable spares quality, we now face the additional challenge that a new part does not always result in a problem solved, and this is particularly frustrating when resolving an issue by a process of elimination. Of course, a supplier is only as good as the manufacturing source it chooses, and with this in mind, if a supplier is vague about origins of manufacture, it would probably be wise to buy elsewhere. While sourcing quality parts does now require research, it's not all bad news. As alluded to earlier, new design solutions to old problems can make older cars even more viable than they were when new. And so the upside is, we have never before had such an accessible network of information, advice and solutions. So let us commence with this honest account of a rolling recommissioning process as it happened. It seems all recommissions begin with finding out if the car is alive, or in other words, will the engine start? Old fuel is the enemy here, so it is always sensible to bypass the fuel tank at this point. As the fuel level was low, it was decided to add new fuel to the old, and whilst probably not a good idea, it worked on this occasion. It will be of no surprise to anyone that the battery that had been neglected for 9 years had to be replaced. An engine compression test confirmed both strong and balanced cylinder pressures, and there was a healthy spark at the plugs. With the 3 combustion elements present, the car did indeed live and ran well enough to start the servicing and setting up process. The engine service was the first encounter with a suspect spare part, and after the oil change, it was clear to see from the oil pressure gauge that the oil pump had to repeatedly fill the oil filter at startup before oil pressure was present. An engine that has a screw-on oil filter mounted in a position where gravity will return oil back to the sump should always have a non-return valve fitted within the filter. In this case, the non-return valve clearly wasn't functioning, if indeed it even had one, and replacing the filter with a MAN-branded filter resolved the issue instantly. The supplier of the original filter had no interest in this evidenced problem and used the defence, "We sell loads of them." It is often quoted that 75 to 90% of engine wear in older engines occurs at startup and during initial warm-up. This would suggest that for the huge number of old cars out there that do not possess an oil pressure gauge, the first indication of this particular problem would be crankshaft bearing failure. When it comes to oil and filters, it appears trusted brands would be the safest bet. The last time the car had been on the road, lead replacement petrol had still been available, but now the car was going to have to run on E5 unleaded petrol, supported by a suitable petrol additive. With this in mind, all rubber fuel lines were replaced, as was the fuel pump. The carburetor had previously been overhauled just 2,000 miles ago, but was still stripped down, cleaned and rebuilt for good measure. With a running engine, the next logical step was a brake service, which in this case was a simple cleaning, lubrication and adjustment exercise, followed by a full system brake fluid change and bleed. The car was now usable, and putting it back on the road had been relatively painless. This continuing account will perhaps go some way towards explaining the difference between a car described as a good runner compared to a car described as lovingly maintained. The difference is often overlooked, and it can equate to many thousands of pounds in expense, not to mention an alarming number of hours' work. Once a classic is up and running, you can get to know the car, and invariably this is when the real work begins. The first road test revealed that the water pump was leaking, and so this was replaced along with the thermostat and temperature sender unit. The original 1968 heater matrix required attention, as it, perhaps not surprisingly, had also started leaking. This was sent away for a recore, and it made sense to clean, strip and repaint the heater assembly whilst it was dismantled. The radiator specialist offered the observation that older vehicles are often easier to repair because of the materials that were used, reaffirming that an old car needn't necessarily be feared. Further driving revealed a slight judder when moving off. This was addressed with new engine mountings, and in the spirit of good practice, a new gearbox overdrive rear mounting was also fitted. After 400 miles, this happened. Removing the fan belt stopped this clattering, so at least this was only an ancillary problem. The alternator had been bought from a scrapyard some 30 years prior, and so it is probably fair to say an upgrade was well overdue. This was a sensible decision, as it had become noisy, but it was not the actual cause of the clattering problem. This was the second experience with poor quality spares, and the new water pump had to be replaced. By providing this video evidence, there was no issue getting a refund from the supplier. However, this didn't compensate for the annoyance of having to do the job twice. The clutch slave cylinder decided to start leaking, and so both the slave and master cylinder were fitted with new seal kits. The steel hydraulic pipe was also replaced with a new copper nickel pipe, and the system bled throughout with new hydraulic fluid. The brake master cylinder was making some disturbing squelching noises, so was replaced with a new unit to ensure there were no braking concerns, and the pressed steel reservoir collar was changed for a more substantial cast metal replacement. Both brake and clutch pedals were fitted with new pedal rubbers, as the old ones were badly worn. Excessive wear in the steering column's lower coupling was discovered, which prompted a full rebuild of the entire steering system. In the interest of originality, wherever possible, parts were reconditioned rather than swapped for exchange units. But once again, the spares market proved challenging. The top-end going rate was paid to recondition the steering rack, but when fitted, it had a heavy knock from the offside. The unit was returned, and when refitted for the second time, the knock was as bad as ever. The supplier insisted that the inner knuckle joints underneath the newly fitted rubber gaiters were not part of the reconditioning service. It would seem I was being unreasonable expecting my newly reconditioned steering rack to pass an MOT, and no solution was being offered. Taking the situation in hand, new inner knuckle joint bushes were ordered from Superflex for just £20 and fitted without needing to remove the rack for a third time. The money, mileage and time wasted was put down to experience. All other steering components and bushes were replaced, and a second-hand upper column shaft was sourced to replace the old unit, which was found to have a damaged steering wheel retaining thread. A separate video shows this steering rebuild. Whilst driving the car on the motorway, with the hood fitted, it was apparent that there was a faint whining from the rear axle. Both the differential and rear wheel bearings were the original units from the 1968 Triumph base car, and so it was decided that the rear axle and suspension would therefore get a complete overhaul. There is a separate video showing this operation, but additional detail can be provided here. The early small Triumphs have a swing axle set up, and the use of Hardy Spicer universal joints on the rear drive shafts appears to be quite a big ask when you consider how much movement these joints have to handle. The nature of car development at the time meant Triumph took a rear axle that originally had to cope with 35 brake horsepower, all the way up to 95 brake horsepower by the time the Mark I Vitesse came along. When replacing these universal joints, it seemed logical that once fitted, the joints would need to move freely and smoothly to be effective. Thanks must be given to Tim at Willow Triumph in Darlington for providing his professional expertise on this matter. In order to contain any side movement, the driveshaft UJs actually need to be very tight, even to the point of feeling quite stiff. Oversized retaining circlips exist for a reason, and they allow potential end float to be contained. Tim also provided his welding and grinding skills to smooth out the car's rear brake backplate surfaces, and this restored the full free movement of the rear wheel cylinders that in turn enabled effective rear brake adjustment. Naturally, new rear trunnion bushes were ordered for rebuilding the trunnion assemblies, but the bushes that arrived were engineeringly unsound, an issue that is clearly explained and demonstrated by Calvin G. Williams on YouTube. Alarmingly, that video sequence is 11 years old, and yet high-profile suppliers are still distributing this very part. This begs the question, how many small Triumphs are out there with them actually fitted? Directing the supplier to these videos meant there was no issue with a refund, so thanks go out to Calvin. Once again, a kit from Superflex was the solution, and with no affiliated interest, it can be said that they have come to the rescue a few times during this project. The improved performance of the restored rear leaf spring initiated some experimentation regarding the number of spring leaves required to create the correct ride height. And it is fair to say that the strip out and refit of the rear axle suspension assembly became increasingly efficient whilst discovering the quirks of the whole setup. With all of that said, now it has been rebuilt appropriately, it proves to be remarkably effective, and furthermore, reports regarding the disappointing life expectancy of expensive CV joint upgrades would imply the original design is indeed a cost-effective solution. The car uses the earlier Triumph's rear axle, which has a 2-inch smaller track compared to the front of the car. The Marlin is very much what you might call a wheel at each corner design, and therefore this track difference is quite noticeable. Fortunately, wheel spacer technology has advanced considerably since more questionable early designs and well-engineered 20mm hub-centric spacers on the rear axle have addressed this imbalance. With little wear to show on the 10-year-old tyres, they looked fine, but rubber degradation is difficult to assess, and as a component so key to road safety, they were replaced for peace of mind. Triumph took the cost-saving decision to fit solid, one-piece prop shafts on some models, and whilst this had been effective for the life of the car, there was now a balance issue. As the car has a fixed differential, the only movement between the gearbox and differential flanges is restricted to the flexing of the various rubber mountings. But can this be considered good engineering practice? The prop shaft specialist, unconvinced that balancing a solid unit was a good solution, suggested fitting a purpose-built, sliding joint prop shaft. As a solution that would take strain off the gearbox, differential and universal joints. This seemed like good advice, and as well as being considerably easier to fit, this new unit has addressed any vibration concerns. With mechanical issues addressed, attention could be turned to subtle improvements that would make the car more pleasurable to live with, alongside enhancements to improve the overall condition of the car. It is considered good practice to disconnect the battery of your classic car, particularly when in storage. An under-bonnet screw-type battery terminal was fitted for this purpose, but it was difficult to know if the battery had disconnected successfully, and it was a pain having to lift the bonnet every time you wanted to do this. A battery isolator switch fitted under the dashboard was a welcome update, and all heavy-duty battery cables were replaced at the same time. The battery charger cable was also hardwired to an under-dash position, meaning the battery can be both disconnected and charged without the need to lift the bonnet. The majority of Marlins sensibly have a centre hinge down the middle of their bonnet. However, it is acknowledged that the one-piece panel of the Mark I is considered an identifying feature. The bonnet on this car had been adapted to open from either side, but on a windy day it was vulnerable due to its sail-like nature. This had only ever been a concern when opened at shows where it might be left unattended, and for this reason, a secondary reinforcing bonnet stay has been added for show use. Triumph made the decision that should your car overheat, then the excess water would be dumped onto the public highway. Whilst overheating has never been an issue, it seemed appropriate to at least capture any potential lost coolant by adding this overflow bottle to the side of the radiator. This is an addition that would be welcomed by show event organisers who want to respect their venue facilities. As part of this recommission process, the tired side screens were revamped and reinstated. The zip design makes them very effective when used with the hood, but there wasn't an option to use them as wind deflectors when the hood was not in use. By adding some simple leather straps with lift dot fasteners, the side screens can now be used without needing the hood, and this transforms the top-down driving experience when travelling at speed. The interior has been tidied with new carpet fitted to the propshaft tunnel, the floor mats have had clip fasteners added, and the gearbox cover has new button-headed Torx head fastenings for a neater appearance. A clock has been a welcome addition, and the very old static seatbelts have been replaced with inertia belts that are proving easier to use and more comfortable. A USB and battery voltage unit has been installed into the dashboard, and the car's vital signs of oil pressure, water temperature, and battery voltage are now in the direct sightline of the driver. Transfer labels have been added to the steering column switch cowls. Labels have been added to the previously unmarked dashboard switches, and a retractable phone holder has been added to allow sat-nav to be used safely. The petrol filler on the car had always been a frustration at the pumps, proving to be slow to fill with the constant threat of fuel blowback. The filler originally consisted of a right-angled metal filler that met with the tank via a rubber hose. This has been replaced with an inlet pipe made from two 45-degree angle stainless steel pipes that provided a much smoother entry into the tank and allows the pump nozzle to slide further into the filler neck. The result is a faster and more relaxed fuel filling experience. Although exempt, the car was MOT'd for peace of mind and passed with no advisories. Unfortunately, on the return journey, the original 1968 Speedo cable decided it was time to fail. But once replaced, the upside has been that the gauge needle has never been as steady or smooth in operation. So only one job remained to be able to say the car was show ready, and that was to give the paintwork some attention. Fortunately, the car is painted with a thick coat of Milano red paint that doesn't have a lacquer top coat, making it quite forgiving when being polished. A clay bar, followed by a buff and polish, gave pleasing results, and whilst the paint isn't perfection, it is very presentable and befitting of an older car. When you finally get to the end of your to-do list, there is no guarantee that it won't be extended, but every so often standing back to take in the results of your handiwork is recommended. Most will see a nice old vehicle, but a select few will truly appreciate what it took to revive another car that really shouldn't have survived, but very much has.